There's a kind of man you've probably encountered at some point. Maybe you are him, or you've been close to becoming him. He's not cold, not performing anything, not wearing his history on the outside. But there's something different in the way he moves through a room. He's unhurried. He listens the way people rarely listen, without the low-grade urgency that makes most conversations feel like they're building towards something he needs. He doesn't manage the impression he's leaving. And if you asked him when he became this way, he wouldn't point to a decision. He'd point to a stretch of time spent mostly alone. What that time does to a man, not to his surface habits or his morning routine, but to something structural in how he actually processes other people, rarely gets talked about with real precision. The most specific and least discussed part of that shift is what happens to how he sees women. Not more coldly, not with more distance or strategy, more clearly. As in, without the particular distortion that almost every man carries through every interaction and doesn't know it's there. Before he could see clearly, he had to understand what he'd been seeing through. That distortion isn't a character flaw or emotional damage. It comes from something most men absorb long before they're old enough to examine it. The unspoken belief that a relationship is what makes a man's life real. That until you're wanted, you're incomplete. That the gap between you and a full life has a woman-shaped outline. Most men carry that belief through their 20s and into their 30s without ever stopping to ask whether it's true or just a story they inherited. And a story you've never questioned shapes everything you see through it. Here's what that story produces without you noticing. Every time your emotional state shifts based on how she's treating you right now, she's warm, you're fine, she goes quiet, you're replaying every recent message looking for what you did wrong. That isn't chemistry. That's a man whose interior ground is unsteady, who's been using the people around him as the thing he stands on. When they move, he moves with them. He's been doing it long enough that he mistakes it for how attraction is supposed to feel. Solitude removes the borrowed flaw. And for a while, longer than anyone who hasn't lived it would expect, that feels like falling. The feedback loop disappears. No one is reacting to you, confirming you in the particular way that kept the quiet anxiety from getting loud. And in that absence, a question that had always been underneath everything finally becomes too loud to avoid. Who are you when no one else is organizing you? Take George. 30 years old, ended a long relationship, moved into an apartment alone for the first time in his adult life. He wasn't dramatic about it, just practical, just moving forward. The first few months he handled the silence the way most men do. Extra hours at work, evenings arranged around people he didn't know particularly well, weekends stacked to prevent a Sunday afternoon with nothing scheduled from becoming something he'd have to feel. He was managing. He was coping. He was also running away from the only thing that was going to change him. Around month 7, the management started losing steam, not because anything went wrong, just because strategies for filling time are only convincing for so long before they start feeling like exactly what they are. George stopped having the energy to construct distraction. What filled the space instead was something quieter. He started noticing what he actually liked. Not what he thought he should like, not what fit the idea of a man with his life together. What he liked, his own rhythm, uninfluenced by anyone else's preferences or expectations. By month 12, he had something he'd never had as a functioning adult. A morning that felt entirely his, not built to impress anyone, not borrowed from an idea of what a productive man looks like. Coffee before anything else. A walk before checking his phone. Reading something he was genuinely curious about. None of it impressive from the outside. All of it came from somewhere real, and that ownership, that minor sovereignty over how he started his own day, was quietly becoming the flaw he'd never had. That flaw changes everything downstream. Without it, a man has no reference point for how another person actually affects his life. He can't tell whether someone adds to him or takes from him. He has no baseline. Anything feels better than the hollow. So he mistakes the relief of being wanted for connection, mistakes turbulence for depth, mistakes intensity for meaning. All of those mistakes feel like the real thing while they're happening, which is exactly what makes them so hard to see through until they've already cost something significant. George went back to dating around 18 months in. Not seriously, just to see how it felt. What surprised him wasn't dramatic. He'd spend an evening with a woman and notice, almost as a side observation, whether the conversation opened something in him or closed it. Whether her energy made the day feel larger or smaller. He'd never asked those questions before because he'd always been occupied with a different one. Does she like me? That swap, from whether she approves to whether he actually wants this, isn't a small adjustment. It changes the entire structure of how a man engages with someone. Here's what almost no one prepares men for. Coming out of real solitude, the common expectation is that they emerge starving for connection, finally open, finally ready, finally willing to let someone in. What tends to actually happen is closer to the reverse, not coldness. The difference matters. Cold is something built to protect something fragile underneath. What solitude tends to produce is patience, a genuine ability to let something develop at its actual speed rather than at the speed anxiety prefers. And patience in how you first meet someone turns out to change everything about what you see, because patience means you're paying attention. You're not monitoring her signals to triangulate your own status. You're not rehearsing the next sentence while she's still finishing hers. You're just there, in the conversation, receiving what's actually being offered. That quality of presence, unhurried, genuinely receptive, not running any agenda, is rarer than most people realize. It creates something in an interaction that no strategy replicates, because strategy is still, at its core, a performance. And this is something else entirely. Consider Arthur, 36, 2 years alone, after a marriage that ended when he was 33. The end hadn't been spectacular. Just two people who'd built a life around a shared structure and found, once it was gone, that neither had quite enough left underneath. Arthur had organized himself around that partnership more than he'd understood while he was inside it. Without it, he was looking at a version of himself that was barely formed independently. A collection of preferences borrowed from someone else's life, routines that had belonged to a version of himself that wasn't entirely his own. The 2 years that followed were, by his own description, the most uncomfortable and most necessary of his life. He had to learn what he actually believed about things when no one else's opinion was in the room shaping the answer. He had to figure out which of his anxieties were real problems and which were just noise he'd carried long enough to mistake for structural. Somewhere around month 16, at a small dinner with colleagues, he ended up in a conversation he hadn't expected and noticed something new. He wasn't doing the usual inventory, monitoring her engagement, managing the impression he was leaving. He was just talking, as himself. And it felt effortless in a way that caught him completely off guard. That effortlessness is the external signal of an interior recalibration. When a man's sense of self has stopped floating, when he actually has a flaw, he doesn't need other people to confirm him, so he can meet them without the hum of need running underneath every exchange. That absence creates real space for the other person to exist in the interaction as themselves, not as a role they're supposed to play in a story he's been writing about his own life. And that transition, from using people to actually seeing them, is the specific change that solitude slowly and completely produces. Projection is the mechanism underneath most of it, and it's the one most men never examine in themselves. Not delusion. You're not inventing someone from nothing. You're taking a real person and layering onto them what you need them to be, then relating to that layer instead of the actual human underneath. Early attraction is almost always projection-heavy because the gaps in what you know about someone are enormous, and hope fills gaps automatically. The problem isn't the hope. The problem is when reality finally arrives, and instead of receiving it as information, you experience it as betrayal, because the image and the person never matched up, and you didn't notice until it was already costing you. A man who's done real time alone has reduced what he needs someone to be. Not because he's lowered his standards, because he's built enough of his own interior that he isn't depending on the relationship to complete it. So when he looks at a woman, he's seeing her, not his own needs wearing her shape. That clarity cuts in both directions. He reads the inconsistencies more readily, yes, but the genuine things land with a weight they've never had before. When someone is honest about something uncomfortable, when she says something that genuinely shifts a perspective he'd held for years, when she's kind in a way that costs her something, that contact is real in a way nothing projection-filtered ever was. I'll say this plainly. The men I've watched go through this don't talk about women the way they used to, not more dismissively, more carefully. Like something they once handled without much thought has revealed itself to be worth real attention. That register doesn't come from anywhere performed. It comes from having finally looked at something clearly. And that shift shows immediately to anyone paying close enough attention. There's an argument that surfaces every time this topic comes up, and it's worth addressing directly. It goes, "This makes sense for men who chose solitude, who arrived voluntarily, who prepared for it. But most men who end up alone for a long stretch didn't choose it. They were left, or something ended, or circumstance chose them. And the implication is that the transformation only counts if you showed up on purpose. What the men who've been through it actually know is that this isn't how it works. The solitude that changes a man doesn't care how it started. What matters isn't the entry point. It's what happens once the first wave of reaction settles. The anger, the grief, the compulsive filling of hours. Once those thin out, what remains is the same silence regardless of how you arrived. And that silence asks the same question every time, of every man, whether he chose this or circumstance chose it for him. Who are you now that there's no one else to organize yourself around? Stay in that question long enough, and you end up somewhere in the same neighborhood, closer to yourself than you've ever been. This connects to something this channel keeps returning to. A man who genuinely knows how to be alone, not performing it as discipline, but actually settled inside his own presence, isn't someone who stopped wanting connection. He's someone who stopped needing it in the specific way that makes want and need feel identical. And the difference between those two states is the difference between choosing someone and falling into someone. Between arriving at a relationship from fullness and arriving from fear of what the alternative still feels like. Those produce completely different things. What doesn't get said enough, and it needs to be said plainly, is that everything around men in this culture is oriented toward ending the silence before it has time to teach anything. Every piece of advice about male loneliness is structured around exiting the state as fast as possible. Get back out there. Use the time productively. Work on yourself so you're ready for someone. All of it treats the silence as a waiting room rather than the actual work. Men who rush the exit carry the same untethered drift into the next relationship they had in the last one, because they never stayed still long enough for the flaw to form. And that's not a small thing to miss, that's everything. What forms when a man does stay still is not dramatic and not visible from the outside. It doesn't look like transformation. It feels like settling, the slow quieting of something that had been loud for so long you'd stopped registering it as noise. The particular hum of anxiety underneath every encounter with a woman, the need to perform, to be evaluated, to be chosen, goes quiet, not suppressed, actually gone, and its absence reveals a quality of attention that couldn't exist before, because the noise had been occupying the space where that attention lives. That attention makes a man genuinely hard to mislead. Not suspicious. The way a guarded person is always braced for disappointment. Something else, like someone with good hearing who catches the off notes in music that a distracted listener misses entirely. He notices when warmth appears and disappears based on what's being asked of someone. He notices when the version of a person that shows up in public doesn't quite match the one that appears when something actually costs them. He notices consistency or its absence because he's paying real attention, not scanning for his own status in the interaction. The other side of that same clarity matters just as much. When something is genuine, not performed, not timed for effect, it lands with a weight that nothing has before. When someone is honest about something uncomfortable with no audience and no benefit to herself. When she says something that catches him off guard and opens the conversation rather than performing one. A man who sees clearly is moved by those things in a way he couldn't have been while living inside the noise. Not swept away, moved. And the difference between being swept away and being moved is the difference between reaction and recognition. Think about what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of that, to talk to someone who is just there, not managing the interaction, not scanning for signals, just genuinely present with you. Most people have never experienced that from someone they're just getting to know. When they do, they feel it immediately, even if they can't name it. It's the particular quality of being seen without being managed. And a man who no longer needs the interaction to go any specific way is the man most capable of offering it, because he's the only one who isn't running something underneath. What living alone long enough ultimately does to a man's mind is this. It removes the category. He stops experiencing women as a thing to navigate, a group to impress or manage or understand collectively, and starts experiencing them as individuals. Complicated, specific, fully real people with their own interior lives and their own reasons for being exactly the way they are. That shift isn't a moral achievement he worked at deliberately. It's what happens when you spend enough time looking honestly at yourself, and in doing so, run out of reasons to distort your view of anyone else. The man who comes out of real solitude doesn't pursue the way he used to, doesn't perform, doesn't orbit, doesn't manage his availability to create tension. He meets people with the same honest and unhurried attention he learned to give himself, and the women who encounter that, who have done their own version of the interior work, whatever path brought them there, tend to recognize it without being able to fully explain why. Not because it's impressive, because it's rare. Most of them have never been on the receiving end of it before. A relationship built between two people who both know how to be alone is structurally different from most of what passes for connection. Not built on filling each other's gaps, because both of them have filled enough of their own that the most desperate gaps are no longer driving the thing. Built on something harder to construct and more durable, two lives that function well independently, and a third thing they build together that neither could have built alone. That isn't a romantic idea. That's just what becomes available when a man stops outsourcing his interior life and starts actually building one. If this landed somewhere real for you, if something in here named what you've been living through without quite having words for it, hit the like button. It tells us this kind of conversation is worth continuing. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is a good time. There's more of this ahead.